Hi, my name is Janice Corello. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Social Work at Edinburgh University. And in this video, I'm going to be presenting you with some strategies for creating a class climate that fosters growth. So here's an outline of the presentation. I have self-assessment here in brackets. In the post for this video, there is a PDF document that has a self-assessment for you on class climate, and it's meant to be used for reflection purposes. Some of the information that's in it will be relevant as we go through this presentation. If you haven't already done that yet, you might want to pause this video and do that. You could also wait and do it at the end of the presentation, and on your own time as well. In the beginning of the presentation, we're going to start off with a little focusing activity. After that, I'm going to provide a little bit of background in theory so that you're aware of the theoretical basis upon which these strategies have been developed. Then we'll go into a section on, I'm calling forecasting, to kind of go with the climate theme. We'll look at signs of class climate problems. After that, we'll take a look at some strategies for addressing any class climate problems. And then lastly, I'll talk about some additional methods for improving class climate. So for our focusing activity, so what I want to do is I'm going to use an analogy of a party invitation. One of the things that we think about with effective teaching and learning is that we want classrooms to be inviting. Right? We don't want them to be coercive, we want them to be inviting. So I'm going to use the analogy of an invitation and have you go along, play along with me with that for a few minutes. So if we take a look at this party invitation, imagine that you've received this, and I want you to think about the tone of it, and as you look at it, how you're hearing these words in your head, right? So as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, oh, nice sunny environment, and here's how I'm hearing it. I'm hearing, you're invited to a party. Please bring a dish to pass. And that sounds like, it's not a lot of details, but it sounds like a party I would be interested in going to. So let's take a look at another invitation. How about this one? This one I'm reading slightly different, right? This one I'm hearing as, well, you RSVP'd for this party, so you should know to bring a dish to pass. And so for me, I don't know about how you're hearing this one in your head. For me, this one, it's not a threatening tone by any means, but it's maybe not quite as positive for me, right? Because I'm thinking that, well, yeah, you're right. I said that I would go, and I will. I'm starting to feel a little, more obliged here. And this bit about knowing that I should bring a dish to pass, well, maybe if I've had a party at your place before, I might know this, or, and know what kind of dish to pass, or information like that. But if I haven't had a lot of experiences with parties, or parties of this kind, or parties with you, then I might not be as informed about this. So I'm feeling, I'm still feeling okay about this. There's still some sunshine and flowers, but I may be feeling a little more cautious than I did with the prior invitation. How about this next invitation? This one I'm hearing a different tone in also. Right, here's how I'm hearing it. Don't you dare miss this party. You will be punished if you don't bring a dish to pass. I don't know about you, but this one doesn't sound as exciting as the last one or the one before that. This one feels a little bit more concerning, because I'm thinking that whether I miss the party or not, there might be some kind of negative consequence for me. So this one's not my favorite one. Let's take a look at another one. How about this one? As you take a look at it, what does it sound like in your head as you read this? Right? I'm hearing, only a loser would miss this party. For once, could you bring a dish to pass? And implied in that is I'm expecting somebody to be like, loser, right? Like, what's wrong with you? You should know better, right? And that you haven't done this well in the past. So this implication that somehow I'm going to be a loser if I miss the party, and that I'm already a loser and I've done things wrong in the past. So this isn't sounding like a party that I'm as excited about, right? So I've got some, right, the clouds are coming in here and a little bit of exasperation. How about this last invitation? Here's how I'm hearing this one. How come you never come to my parties anymore? Look, if you do come, don't bring that disgusting dish you brought last time. Bring something edible. Make sure it can serve at least 30 people, and don't store it in plastic. Plastic is evil and will not be tolerated. Neither will nuts, sugar, dairy, gluten, meat, shellfish, food dyes, preservatives, or alcohol. Or fun. You will be asked to leave if you try to sneak in any of these. Well, now, obviously, I'm being, I'm trying to be a bit silly here. And clearly there are times that, if we're thinking about extending this analogy to class environments, we absolutely need policies, and we often need specific policies, and we often have to include information because we're trying to include as many people as possible, and we're trying to protect people from things. So we might need some wording, but I want us to think about the kind of tone that we're using, right? If this sounds a bit more accusatory, and if previous invitations have looked a bit like some of the more negative ones we've had, then it might start to make more sense why we've been avoiding some parties, right, by this person. So again, if you haven't done the self-assessment yet, and you've been having some issues in your classrooms, now might be a good time to do that. And then we'll go on in the next section, and I'll provide a little bit of background and theory before we get into some actual temperature taking and some strategies. So in terms of background and theory, so my background is in, I study re-traumatization in educational settings, and I have been advocating for bringing a trauma-informed approach to higher education. So that informs a lot of what I'm doing and the information here about class climate. So one of the things that I study in particular is I look at the effects of trauma on teaching and learning. And what I found, there's a lot more information on this, but in a nutshell for you for this presentation, we know that there is a negative impact of trauma and re-traumatization on teaching and learning. And if we look at some of the neurobiological impacts of trauma, this starts to make sense. So I just want to go over a little bit of information real quick about this. So if you're thinking about it, when people feel threatened, right? So when there's traumatic events and people perceive that there's a threat in their environment, their body goes into survival mode, right? So the energy that they have is not going to their prefrontal cortex. It's going to other parts of their brain, and it's going to other parts of their body in order to help them survive this threat. So they go into what we refer to as fight, flight, or freeze mode. And we could do a whole lecture on some of the impact on the neurobiological impact and how it affects learning. But this chart gives us an idea about some of the ways that when our body goes into this survival mode, the different hormones that are affected, the chemicals that are affected, and the way that the brain and the body respond. And so we can see that because of some of these things that are happening in the brain, it can lead to emotional dysregulation. It can lead to impaired memory. There are problems with speech. We know, for example, with children who have been exposed to severe childhood abuse, they often have learning disabilities and reading disabilities. Trauma impairs thinking, judgment, and processing, right? Again, people go into this survival mode, and they get hypervigilant about their environment and threats that may be present in their environment. So when we take a look at this, we can see, right, it makes sense then because of the neurobiological processes, how it impairs teaching and learning. Another way to look at this is if we look at the impact on emotion regulation, right? So ideally we have people in this, what we call optimal arousal zone, right? So this is where their emotions are regulated. It's where they are alert but relaxed, right? And their prefrontal cortex is still online, and they're still able to learn what some researchers refer to as stay and play mode, right? So notice it's not flat line here. People will move up and down. Sometimes they'll go, up into upper hyperarousal or down into freezing or numbing, but they can pull themselves back into this zone where they can learn. If we're thinking about re-traumatization, so when people are having, there may be some type of relationship dynamics, or there may be some type of a memory trigger where they're having these symptoms and they feel like they're threatened and they go into survival mode. When they're in fight or flight mode, that may look like acting out in some way. So people who are agitated, who may be angry, and they may be, walking out of the classroom or complaining, or lots of words in an email. So there's lots of ways that this comes out and looks kind of like acting out in this fight or flight mode. And then sometimes people respond by freezing, right? So think of deer in the headlights type response, right? Where people, they call this freeze. Go back. Sorry about that. Freeze or appease mode. So where they're like, if we're in a classroom situation where students are just, they're just yesing you. They're not really paying any attention. They're just trying to say what they need to be done with it and get out of the way. Sometimes it looks like students not turning in work or just shutting down, right? And so if we're using our climate analogy, right? So here we've got these fires going on that we're trying to deal with, right? And here we might have an ice storm and nobody's responding, right? And this can happen to us as educators also, where we're feeling agitated, right? Acting out, angry. Our anxiety is really high. Or we're down here where we just feel overwhelmed, we feel drained, we're just zoning out, and don't have the energy to deal with things. And we want to be able to be in the stay and play mode also. So in terms of trauma-informed teaching and learning, so trauma-informed teaching and learning is about culture and climate. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with trauma-informed care, I want to take just a minute to give you some information on that. So to be trauma-informed in any context means to understand the ways that violence and victimization and other forms of trauma can have a negative impact on individuals, on families, and on communities. And then to also use that understanding about trauma in order to inform policies and practices that prevent re-traumatization and promote resilience and growth. And so when we're talking about being trauma-informed, we're talking about shifting our focus. So instead of focusing solely on individuals and their symptoms and asking questions like, well, what's wrong with you? Why are you responding like this? Right? We would be perceiving trauma as some kind of disorder, right? Something wrong with the individual. A trauma-informed focus asks us to start looking at individuals in their environment and asking what's happened to you that you're having this type of response, right? And then we're looking this way, then it's an attempt to depathologize people's behaviors and people's responses and to view trauma as some type of injury or disability. In terms of sources of re-traumatization, right? So if we're looking at, I'm going to go back real quick, right? So we start paying attention to environment, and in this case, we're paying attention to classroom environments. And if we start taking a look at some of the sources of re-traumatization, so things that create this stormy environment in classrooms. So I've done some research on this, and one of the things that I found by studying students in an MSW program, I looked at students and faculty and staff, and what I found when I asked them about significantly distressing experiences that they had, they talked about significantly distressing experiences both within their MSW program and outside of the program. And contrary to what we might believe had happened, some of the popular literature has us thinking that it's mostly content that is distressing and creating stress and distress for people. What I found in my survey was that it was often interpersonal relationships that were causing this significant distress. So when they were experiences outside the program, they often had to do with the death or illness of a loved one, or some type of assault or injury or bullying that had occurred, or a death, right? If it wasn't a family member, but of a client. In terms of within classrooms, it often had to do with policies and practices in the classroom. When it was field work, it had to do often, less often with experiences with clients, but experiences with between students and educators. When it was content, it wasn't so much about the content. It was about there had been a failure to titrate exposure or to give some type of a trigger warning, right? And so when I looked at all of these, a lot of them had to do with interpersonal conflict, right? That these kinds of things were happening in relationship. And so the source of the trauma wasn't, it wasn't just content, right? It really had to do with conflict between educators and students in many cases, particularly if somebody perceived this experience as threatening, abusive, oppressive, neglectful, abandoning, right? So if they felt like they were being threatened or singled out in some way because of them as a person or some group that they belonged to, that they identified with, in times when they felt that there may be unfair or disproportionate punishment, those were times that they considered significantly distressing also. And so these were the types of events that affected the class climate, both for students and also for educators. This, of course, makes sense because we know that teaching and learning and trauma are all about relationships. Right? We know that students have relationships not only with the content that they're learning, but also with other students. You know, right? They have relationships with their educators, right? And then there are relationships with the school and society that affect the relationships that are in the class as well. So one of the things about 18 years ago when I started teaching, one of the things that I discovered was Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication model. And this was long before I knew anything about trauma or trauma-informed care. I wanted to improve the relationship that I had with my students. And so I started using some of the nonviolent communication techniques and integrating those practices into my classroom practices and policies. And one of the underlying assumptions of the nonviolent communication model is similar to what we think of in trauma-informed care, is that people are, the symptoms that people have and the responses that they have, people are doing the best they can to cope, right? That their behavior has to do with some type of a need that they're trying to get met, and that the same is true for us also, right? That our behavior is influenced by and motivated by needs that we have. And when we can understand that, Rosenberg argues, then we might still have conflicts, but we can think about how to get through the conflict in a different way so we don't see each other as enemies anymore, and we can try to be compassionate so that everyone's needs get met. So the way that Rosenberg talks about it, and we can think about it in terms of emotional development. So when we're thinking about trauma, we might be thinking about it in terms of coping devices. And so when people have less mature coping devices that they're using, they haven't developed more mature coping devices yet, that would correspond with Rosenberg's emotional slavery stage. And this is where people feel responsible for others' feelings, and that can really weigh them down a lot. They're very worried about how other people are going to react, particularly if they believe that reaction is going to be threatening. The next stage that Rosenberg talks about, he actually calls this obnoxiousness, and to me that didn't seem very nonviolent communication congruent, so I've changed it to emotional rebellion. But what Rosenberg's talking about here is when people get to a stage where they feel angry and they don't want to be responsible for others' feelings, but they're not quite sure yet how to be responsible to others rather than for others in a way that doesn't feel enslaving, right? So they don't have they have the awareness that there are other coping is available, but they're not really skilled in it yet. And then the last stage that Rosenberg talks about is emotional liberation. And this is where we can take responsibility for our own intentions and our own actions to get our needs met and respond to others' needs out of compassion rather than responding out of guilt or fear or shame or in doing things for those reasons. In terms of how this then corresponds with what we were talking about in terms of emotional regulation and growth, so if we go back to that, the arousal chart that we had before, so emotional liberation might be in that stay and play area that we were talking about, or what Rosenberg would talk about in terms of being able to self-disclose and connect with others. Right? We can be compassionate to them and take care of our own needs and be able to respond in ways so that they are able to meet their needs as well. We might think about the emotional rebellion stage is that fight or flight, attack and defend mode, right? Where people are acting out of anger or fear and trying to defend themselves that way. And then we might think about Rosenberg's emotional slavery zone as this freeze, appease, or avoid or deny mode, where people are more dissociated and operating and responding to people out of guilt, fear, or shame instead of out of compassion. So that may be one way to think about how these models inform each other. Another body of literature that I started looking at, and this was maybe, I don't know, about a dozen years ago, I discovered some of the research by the Gottmans, John and Julie Gottman, and through the Gottman Institute. They've done a ton of research on what they call sound relationships. A lot of it focuses on marriage relationships, but they also look at parenting, and they also look at work relationships. And they have, in their books and in their information and on their blog, they have ways that they are applying these principles to sound relationship workplaces. And so these are some of the foundational principles that they have around creating a kind of shared culture, facilitating in workplace, it might be career, but it's facilitating growth here, managing conflict, right? We're not eliminating it, but we're trying to handle it more effectively. Using more of a strengths-based perspective, being able to respond with people and engage with them, that connection aspect, being able to provide positive feedback, and this has to do with knowing each other, so that we build the kind of trust and commitment in order to enhance, right, in this case when we're applying it to education, in order to enhance both teaching and learning. So I've adopted a lot of information from the Gottmans too. So one of the things when we take a look at these, right, it makes sense that these help inform each other, because whether we're looking at trauma-informed care or nonviolent communication or the sound relationship research, they're all congruent with these principles of trauma-informed care, which emphasize safety, trustworthiness, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, and intersectionality, right, being aware of the impact of intersectionality. And so that provides the theoretical basis from which I am presenting these strategies. So in this next section, I'm going to talk about signs of relationships and climate problems. And this first set of information I've adapted from the work of the Gottman Institute, and that many of it appears on the Gottman blog. And there are citations here, and at the end of the presentation, there will be slides that have the references so you can locate this information. So one of the first things that the Gottmans talks about in terms of predicting relationship problems or climate problems, right? Because when we're talking about climate problems, we're talking about relationship problems. Is one of the first signs is harsh startups. So one of the things the Gottmans talk about is that, you know, most of the time you can predict the outcome of a conversation based on just the first few minutes. I know when I've been doing class observations over the last couple of decades, and even sometimes just looking at syllabi, right? Just the first few minutes of a class, or just looking at some of the way that the class syllabi are phrased, I can often tell what the tone is going to be like in the classroom and what the climate's going to be like. When the Gottmans are talking about harsh startups, they're talking specifically about conversations that start off with attacking, blaming, people are being accusatory, or in situations where people are using one of the four horsemen, which I'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. In terms of what harsh startups look like in the classroom, so I've provided some examples here, and I've been trying to draw on examples based on my own experience. So I don't know about you all, but I know there have been plenty of times when I've been in a traditional classroom setting when the first thing that comes out of a student's mouth, right, they come in, they slump down into a chair or into a desk, and they're saying, "Can we get out early?" And I don't know about you, but that's not the first thing that I want to hear out of a student's mouth when they come in the classroom. Many of you are probably also familiar with this second example, right? Students who kind of start off by accusing us, right? "Why did you give me such a bad grade? You're going to make me lose my scholarship." Right? And then I have a question mark here because maybe you could pause the video and you could probably come up with some of your own examples of some of the harsh startups that you have experienced with students. Sometimes we start off harshly ourselves and we may not realize it. Perhaps when a student has come in, rather than greeting them in some way and understanding what has happened to them that they are coming in 5 minutes after class started, you just say something curt to them like, "You're late." Right? That happens sometimes. Another example might be saying something to students like, "Well, why would you think I would accept this late? Does this look like high school?" Right? And so again, it's thinking about saying these kinds of things, and then this may be the first interaction that you've had with them during that class period. And again, here is a time where you might want to pause the video and think about examples that you've witnessed in classes, maybe when you were a student, or sometimes when something's been going on for you and you may have responded you may have started with a harsh startup. Another thing that the Gottman's research has shown us is that the four horsemen, which I'll go over in just a moment, they often look at these in terms of being able to predict divorce, right? We don't divorce each other in classrooms, or students and educators don't get divorced, but we can see how this would affect things like, student evaluations, our reputations, students' reputations, right? So divorce is not involved, but you can see how this has some negative long-term damage on relationships. And so when they're talking about the four horsemen, the first one is criticism. And so criticism, it may not be what you typically think of. So here we're talking about attacking character. We're not talking about giving negative or constructive feedback. It's different than feedback or a complaint because it's focusing on identity rather than on behavior. So for example, asking or implying, "What's wrong with you?" Right? "Why can't you do this right?" Right? So again, it implies that there's something wrong with their character or identity rather than focusing on behavior. Contempt is the second of the four horsemen. This is behavior then, things like ridiculing or treating people disrespectfully or as somehow lesser than you, right? It puts you in a position of superiority in some way. And this might look like things, both verbal and nonverbal, such as eye rolling, name calling, sarcasm, mocking, right? We hear about splaining, right? Things like what we hear, mansplaining, white-splaining, cis-splaining, those kinds of things. Or some type of hyper-correction or opposition where you're constantly telling people, "No, this," right? Or "Yes, but." Whenever you have "but" in a sentence, it negates everything that came before, right? And if this is chronic, then that might convey a sense of contempt to people. The third of the four horsemen is defensiveness. So this is when you are picturing yourself and positioning yourself as the victim, perhaps making excuses, cross-complaining, or even retaliating in some way, right? So if somebody has made a complaint in some way or brought some information to you, some feedback, and then and when you respond, you feel like you must defend yourself in some way. So it might look something like, "Well, how could you say that about me?" Or, "That's not my fault," or turning it around so that it becomes, they become blamed for it, right? "Well, if you hadn't done that, then I wouldn't have to respond in this way, right? Look what you made me do." So those types of responses. And the last of the four horsemen, the Gottmans call stonewalling. And so this is where people, I think this is more like the dissociative type ones we were looking at. So people are really trying to avoid conflict. They're withdrawing, they're shutting down. In some cases, it might be that they're acting busy, right? They look like they're on their computer or their phone, right? And they're not paying attention. They may not be responding to you, or when they are, they might be using just monosyllabic responses, right? Yep, right, right? And they're really not present in connecting with you. And that's a way that they are trying to defend themselves. What the four horsemen might look like in class, right? So with students, sometimes you don't hear from them. They don't respond to emails. They don't talk in class. Sometimes the whole class this happens to, and they're all shut down and they're all quiet. Sometimes they get defensive with us and they say things, like, well, if you didn't give ridiculous amounts of homework, I might get your stuff in on time, right? And so they're defending themselves. Or you've probably heard these, stonewalling one-word answers like, whatever, right? Or I love this one GIF. I don't know if you're familiar with the Harry Potter movies, right? But this Hermione's eye roll, and sometimes, as Snape would put it, right, she is an insufferable know-it-all, and she's great, but sometimes, right, she's in this mode where she's being hypercritical, and that's what this GIF is illustrating. Sometimes we engage in this type of defensive behavior as instructors also. I know we like to think that we get back to every student, but sometimes we're not responding to email. Some of these examples are based on things that I've actually witnessed other instructors do. I did have an instructor whose contract was not renewed, and in class they collected student papers and in front of the students put all of their papers in the recycle bin and let them know that they were doing that because their contract had not been renewed. I've also had students who showed me their paper, and on it had been written comments like, the ship has left the dock and you were not on it. So that type of feedback that, again, is more attacking the person rather than the behavior, right? And clever, but at whose expense, right? And sometimes it's general comments too, like, well, I don't know how or why you got into this class or this school or this program. And again, it's not focusing on behavior, but it's focusing on the person's character, which can be really damaging and certainly can affect the climate. And so I have the question marks here again, because this might be a good time to pause and think about the four horsemen as you may have witnessed them or engaged in them yourself at times in the classroom. Flooding is another sign that there may be climate problems, and here we're talking about physical and emotional distress, right? So people in that fight or flight mode or that freeze and appease mode, where people, they're having trouble dealing with the emotional feelings that they're having, they're feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes this ends up looking like expressions of indignation. Well, I shouldn't have to put up with this, right? Or things like feelings of victimhood, right, that start to look kind of like that defensiveness. Why is everyone picking on me? And one of the things that's important to note with flooding is that when people are in this mode, when they're emotionally overwhelmed in this way for whatever reason, whether it has to do with what somebody is saying or because they're having some of their own emotional memories and symptoms triggered, it's really hard for people to hear repair attempts from others when they're flooded. So sometimes people are actually trying to say they're sorry or trying to make it up in some way, but sometimes when people are this overwhelmed, it's really difficult for them to respond to those repair behaviors, those repair attempts. What flooding might look like in class, right? So again, sometimes we get silent treatment during class discussion. I don't know if this has happened to you, but sometimes I've been in class discussions where a student says something that is a bit insensitive, and then they may try to repair that in some way, and other students have a hard time hearing it because they're getting flooded. I remember being in class discussions and saying, right, but she's trying to show that she understands, and the other person just, right, they weren't in a place where they could hear it very well. So those kinds of behaviors might be apparent. Sometimes walking out of class. I had one time a student, it was during the last couple of weeks of school, and I found out after the fact that the student was very overwhelmed by all of the work that they had to do in classes and getting prepared for final exams. In my class, what has happened is sometimes students will just walk out, or in this third example, I had a student who just in front of the whole class very loudly in doing their group work was like, "Why are you making us do all this busy work?" Right? In which everybody got very quiet, right? And I had to, respond to the student. And again, what I found out was that she was, just overwhelmed, and we had a conversation, about maybe she had other priorities, and it would be better for her to, to leave class early, and that she hadn't missed any classes, and then that would not, affect her grade in any way. But trying to get at some of the underlying reasons why students might respond in this way. And you can probably think of some of your own. With instructors, we see flooding happen sometimes also. Sometimes instructors are avoiding discussion of certain topics. That might be during a semester or an individual conversation, but sometimes we're so sensitized, or sensitive to that, that we may avoid discussions over and over again. This may become chronic for us because we're afraid of how students will respond and we won't know how to react. Sometimes instructors get overwhelmed and then just cancel class or let students out early. Sometimes they lose control of the class discussion, and things can, and they can unfortunately go even more downhill from there. And so again, the question marks, this might be a good time to pause and think about what flooding in class may have looked like for you, either in your own classes or in classes that you have been a student in, or that you have or that you've observed. Failed repair attempts is another sign of climate problems. And so here what we're talking about is the inability to de-escalate tension, right? And here's where we're talking about this inability to hear repair attempts from others. We have a difficult time accepting an apology or letting somebody else make amends because we're so upset. And then there might be this repetitive cycle then of recrimination or defensiveness because we can't hear it, right? And because we're responding defensively, right? And then this cycle just continues. In terms of what failed repair attempts might look like in class, so again, some of this looks similar to the types of behaviors we see with the flooding, people walking out of class, some of those, yes, but. So they're, instead of just saying, I accept your apology and moving on, they continue to argue and point out, right, how they feel they've been wronged in some way, or continue with the defensiveness, right? Or, yeah, I did what the professor said, but I still got a bad grade, right? Or engaging in more of the four horsemen, right? So they're doing more of the stonewalling, defensiveness, contempt, or criticism. Right, they're still rolling their eyeballs even when you've tried to, I'll regrade your paper, but that's not enough, right? In terms of instructors, so again, sometimes we'll see some of those familiar behaviors like canceling class, right? Like I can't deal with them. They may be trying to behave better, but I can't deal with it anymore. We might engage in some of the yes buts, right? The students are trying to revise something or make an apology, and we're negating that in some way because we're overwhelmed still. It might look like things like, I changed the policy, but I still get complaints. And we may not be saying this to students, but sometimes we say this to each other a lot, right? Or we might be engaging still in the four horsemen after these types of repair attempts. And so again, the question mark to invite you to pause and think about what these failed repair attempts, if you've experienced them, what they may have looked like in classes that you've been part of. So now that we've looked at some of the signs that you might be having some climate problems in your classroom, some relationship problems in your classroom, what I want to talk about is some strategies for addressing these climate problems The good news is that there are things that help. One of the things I've noticed over the last, many years that I've been teaching, I have been trying all of the strategies that I'm going to present to you in my classrooms, and they really do make a difference. I do have conflict with students still, obviously, but it's not, it's productive, right? I don't have power struggles with students anymore. I don't have any big storms with students anymore. And I found that they're very helpful in regulating the climate. Again, some things we want things a little more heated or a little more cooled off, and they're not going to just, be, flatline. It's not always going to be perfect weather. But these types of strategies help us weather these storms more effectively and make them a more temperate climate. So in terms of antidotes for the four horsemen, so I'm getting this from the Gottman blog. One of the things they talk about in order to provide an antidote to criticism is to use soft startups. And here, one of the things they recommend is using I statements. And I'll give you some examples of those in a couple of minutes. And then also expressing positive needs. And I'll give you some more concrete examples of those too. In terms of an antidote for contempt, the antidote for that would be to develop a culture of appreciation. So I know as instructors, we often have to point out where students need improvement, and that often comes out as focusing on the negative. But it's also important that we pay attention to the positive qualities of students and their strengths, right? And so I'll give you some examples of that. In terms of an antidote to defensiveness, the antidote for that would be to take responsibility, right? Here's where it's important to accept another person's perspective, right? That doesn't mean you agree with it. It just means that you are hearing it and that you are accepting that they hold it and you're willing to hear them out. And then apologizing when you make mistakes, right? So that's part of what this might look like. And then an antidote for stonewalling is self-soothing. So being able to calm yourself down and work on regulating yourself so you're in that stay and play mode, taking a break and coming back, right? So you're not just walking away permanently and ending the conversation, it's taking a break and then returning to the conversation. Calming yourself, right? Helping to calm others and engaging in self-care. So some of the nonviolent communication strategies help us understand what some of these antidotes look like. And so if you take a look at the nonviolent communication model, it looks a lot like assertive communication, which many of you might be familiar with. And it has these 4 steps around observations, feelings, needs, and requests. One of the things that the NVC model emphasizes is using I statements. Right? And so, for example, when people are making observations, right, they're using I statements and taking responsibility for their perceptions, versus oftentimes we're making judgments and we're pointing at the other person and focusing on how somehow we're kind of giving our power away. So I'll go through these examples. So instead of saying I felt angry and taking responsibility for how we're feeling, we often point to other people and say you made me mad. Right? Instead of saying I would like to talk, we might make the judgment we need to talk. Well, I might feel I need to talk to you, but you might not feel like you need to talk to me, right? So I can't speak to what your needs are. And the third example, instead of saying something like, I don't see the required elements, right, which would be more a statement of fact, we make a judgment that looks something like, well, you ignored the directions, right? Well, I can't really know that that person deliberately ignored something, right? But what I can observe is that the things that I needed to see weren't present in that assignment. In the fourth example, right, we might be saying something like, I don't understand, instead of this doesn't make sense, right? It could be that it makes sense to other people, but not to us, right? Sometimes when we don't understand things, we think that must be somebody else's problem or somebody else's responsibility and not ours. And then lastly, we might say, instead of something like, well, you're wrong, we might acknowledge that, well, my view is different. Right? or put it another way, right? Sometimes it is a misstatement of fact, right? We might say something like, that contradicts what I know to be true, right? So that we're using those I statements instead of you statements and judgments. Another strategy that is useful in classrooms is to be giving more feedback instead of advice. Sometimes we don't pay a lot of attention to the difference, so often we're giving evaluations and we're giving opinions or suggestions for what students should do instead of giving feedback, which is information about their progress toward a goal. Okay, so we might be saying things like, well, you should have cited at least 3 sources, instead of, well, you haven't yet cited the required number of sources. Or we might be saying something like, well, you should visit a tutor, instead of just pointing out to them the information that tutoring services are available if you're interested, right? Because in this first column here, and that's why I have this person wagging their finger, it assumes that we know better than the other person what they need to do, right? And that can come off as hostile, and that can come off as you know, a lower level form of violence in this nonviolent communication model, right? So providing some feedback and considering that instead of always giving advice. And in the nonviolent communication model, another strategy that one can use is expressing needs, right? And again, we're using I statements here and we're leaving out you. It involves being positive, using positive language, being specific, explaining to people what to do rather than what not to do, and then giving very concrete rather than vague examples. So some examples here. Instead of telling students, well, you need to cite properly, we might say instead, I need to see all of the references cited in APA in order to assign a passing grade. Instead of saying, well, don't turn in the paper late, we could say, to assign full credit, I need the paper to be submitted by the due date. Because the reality is we're the ones in charge of the grading, right? And in order to feel comfortable assigning that grade, those are the conditions that need to be met. And the last example here is, instead of something more vague like fix your citations, I could be specific instead and say, we'll see page 62 of the APA manual for help with your heading format, okay? Or whatever other APA issue there is. Another strategy that we can use is making requests versus demands. And there are reasons for this. So when we make requests, we're emphasizing compassion. We're showing recognition of and empathy for other people's needs. We're taking responsibility for our own needs, and it's a more empowering approach. Versus when we make demands on people, when we make demands on students, we're emphasizing fear and obedience, right? So we're getting people to act, right? It's not at that highest level of emotional maturity, right? They're still acting to please us or out of fear of us or because they feel they must obey us, right? And so we're not modeling that emotional maturity and we're not providing space for it. When we make demands on people, they feel like they must comply or rebel, right? And then often when people don't meet our demands, then we feel like we are either obligated to or entitled to criticize them or judge them or assign guilt to them if they don't comply. And this comes off as more authoritarian. Where when we're talking about trauma-informed models and we're talking about having a more productive class climate that fosters growth, we would want a more authoritative tone, a more authoritative style that's firm but fair rather than authoritarian. So making requests then, these are some examples of what it might look like. So we're using the nonviolent communication model. And so we point out the observation, this is what you did, right? The feeling, this is what I feel. The need, right? And so this is the need, value, or desire that was not met. And then the request of what you'd like to see happen. And so this might, the formula is when blank happens, I feel blank because it really matters to me that blank. Would you be willing to fill in the blank? And so an example, and I actually structured responses to students like this frequently, and it might look something like, you know, when you don't turn in your work, I get concerned because it really matters to me that you succeed in this course. Would you be willing to meet with me to discuss how you can get caught up? Another strategy is showing appreciation, and so this looks similar to the nonviolent communication model, except we're leaving out the request, right? And I know if you're not used to doing this, it feels, you know, a little odd, but again, I actually give feedback to students like this a lot, and the feedback I get from them is that they find it helpful. So pointing out those concrete examples also, so something like, I was really happy to see you use meaningful subheadings. They help me navigate your paper, right? Or thank you for the email. I was worried because you missed several classes, and I'm really glad to know that you're feeling better now, right? So not just general, you know, vague feedback, but pointing to behaviors of theirs that made a positive difference, so they know to keep doing that more. Another strategy is responding with empathy. So I'm going to give you a scenario, and then I'm going to give you a moment to think about what your response is to this. So here's the scenario. So imagine you have a student coming in saying in a really loud, angry voice, "Why did you give me such a bad grade on this test? I've never gotten this bad of a grade before. This is going to mess up my course grade and my GPA. And if that happens, it's going to mess up my scholarship. Then what am I going to do? It's not fair." You've probably heard students say things like this, right, or get emails that look like this. So I want you to take a moment and think about your response, right? How would you respond to this? One of the things that Rosenberg points out is that empathizing is not the same as some of these other types of responses. So sometimes we think we're empathizing, but we might actually be doing something like advising, you know, "Oh, well, you should study more next time." Right? Sometimes we end up one-upping. "Oh, let me tell you about all the tests I failed," right? Sometimes we go into educator mode, right? Studies show that most people fail at least one test in their lifetime, right? So don't feel so bad. Sometimes we're in consoling mode. "Oh, you know, well, at least you're passing the course," right? Because we don't want them to feel bad, and so we're trying to console them so that they won't feel bad. Sometimes we're sympathizing instead of empathizing, and so we might say something like, "Oh, I'm really sorry you failed the test," right? Or we're interrogating. "Well, how the heck did you fail the test if you studied for it?" Right? Or we're correcting them in some way, and I'm imagining Hermione Granger again with this one. But you know, technically a D is passing, right? Versus empathizing with someone else, right? In this case, a student. And so when I hear a student say something like that, usually I take a step back, right? And I respond with something like, "Wow, it really sounds like you're disappointed with your grade." Mm-hmm. So something like that. Sometimes depending on if it was a lot of anger, I might say, "Wow, it sounds like you're really angry with me right now about your grade." Because sometimes, right, naming the feeling and acknowledging it, right? Sometimes students just need the empathy, right? They don't need these other forms of responses. They need to know that we heard them, and that it's, right? And that the world's not going to end because they're upset about something. How do we know if empathy is working? Well, a couple of the ways that Rosenberg points out is that there's often a release of tension when empathy is working, right? When you're able to name it and you're able to recognize it, then students will often respond automatically with that release of tension. And then sometimes you get emails that are really wordy, or you get people who are talking using a lot of words because they're anxious, and that flow of words might halt, right? And then we know that they feel heard. Okay. A few additional methods for improving class climate. So the ones that we just looked at were based very specifically on nonviolent communication strategies. And I'm going to talk about just some that I've been using from all different sources over the years that I found helpful. And the thing to remember about all of these strategies is that we're trying to help ourselves and others regulate versus escalate the conflict. Right? So another strategy is knowing students. So it really helps if you know your students individually a bit, as well as knowing about them more generally as a cohort. So reading about the characteristics, right? What is Gen Z like, right? How are they different than some of the, right? If you've been teaching for quite a while, as I have, how are they different than some of the cohorts of students you've worked with? In terms of individual knowing, learning students' names and their pronouns, using strategies like collecting information on index cards or through posts if you are teaching online. Interest polls can be useful, doing some classroom icebreakers, and that can help you so that not only do you know students, but they get to know each other, right? And so that there's more connection in the class that way. Another strategy is some type of connection ritual in the class. So it might be like something like that focusing activity we did at the beginning of this presentation, or something that I've done the whole 18 years I've been teaching so far is using what are called position puzzles that look like this diagram here on the right. So position puzzles are puzzles where you put words and letters and symbols next to each other in order to come up with some kind of a common word or phrase. And when I'm teaching face-to-face classes, and even sometimes when I'm teaching online classes, I start off each class with these, or each module with these. And I've gotten wonderful feedback from students over the years. They really look forward to this. It's a way to start class. It's a way to build a sense of community, and again, get that prefrontal cortex online and working. And by the way, if you haven't figured out this puzzle, right, look at this word here and how it's positioned between this. So we've got very interesting, in case you wanted to know the answer to that one. Another strategy is temperature taking. And so one of the things that I've been integrating in my classes over the last 5 or 6 years or so is using check-in cards or posts or some type of quiz feature if you're doing an online class. And I ask students to complete a sentence starter about their experiences in the course. Typically, you could do this weekly. I tend to do it about every other week. And then students provide you with some formative feedback so that you can make adjustments during the course of the semester. We often wait and then use the summative feedback at the end of the semester and the student evaluations of learning, and then we apply that to the next class, and that doesn't help the current class that we're in. So if we're taking the temperature as we go and getting feedback from students, we can make adjustments to assignments, to due dates, to instructions, deadlines, in order to help adjust the climate, in order to improve the class while we're in it. Another strategy is preventing power struggles. Sometimes we don't realize how some of our policies and practices set up power struggles with students that could be avoided. When we avoid, for example, using zero tolerance policies, then it makes it easier for all students' needs to get met. We don't have a bunch of excuses from students. They don't have to provide them. We can apply these fairly and consistently, these types of policies. And so as an example, one of them that's been really popular in my classes is the use of late days. I give all students 5 late days, no questions asked, that they can use on major assignments. And so all they need to do is let me know by email 30 minutes in advance that they're going to be using 1 or more late days. And this has saved students. I've gotten lots of positive feedback about this. They don't have to provide me with excuses. I don't have to negotiate with them. They feel like this is fair, and that's made a tremendous difference in my classes in terms of climate. Other types of strategies that go with this might be things like scaffolding assignments and breaking them down into smaller bits, providing a limited number of revise and resubmits. Right? And I'm sure you can think of things that you've done and search for other strategies that would go with this that would be helpful. Also, being sure to pick your battles. Because if everything is important, nothing's important. I've seen syllabi before where there is literally an entire page of instructor pet peeves that students must avoid, right? And when everything becomes that important and it's grounds for failure, you're going to get into power struggles with students, right? And then you're going to become at war with your students before you've even started, in which case you've kind of already lost, right? You've already got a negative climate that's focused on failure instead of on learning and on success. And then one of the strategies that I found most helpful, I actually started using this when my children were teenagers, was what I call the 3 magic words. Help me understand. When I get at an impasse with students and I'm finding that I'm having difficulty managing the conflict in a productive way, right, I can just stop and help me understand your concern, right? And so that's a good strategy to try out. Of course, practicing self-care is really important. It helps if our departments have policies and practices in place that help support us in that way, but it's going to be difficult for us to maintain a temperate climate in our classrooms if we're not taking really good care of ourselves and making sure that our needs are getting met. And then, so one of the things, so we've looked at many of these different strategies. So one of the things I want you to think about that relates to self-care is moving forward, and then moving forward in connection with others, right? So not trying to do this alone. That's why I have this picture here. Thinking about how you connect with other educators to continue these conversations and to talk about strategies and things that are working in order for you to be able to do this in connection with others and not feel like you're going it alone. So as we move forward, I'm going to invite you to think about which new strategy you would try, right? That will help you, right, create that more positive invitation like we were talking about in the focusing activity, so that you enjoy going to your classes also, and that the climate is positive not only for your students, but also for yourself. If you have questions or comments, you can post them here in the comment section on the blog. You can also contact me at the email address on the screen. I thank you for listening to this presentation. And again, there are some references here on the last few slides, and I will attach a PDF of this to the post so that you have those available to you. Thank you.